Have you ever heard of the halo effect? It's this psychological thing where one good trait, one bright spot, makes us assume the whole thing was good. One great memory, and suddenly that entire season gets this warm glow around it. Like it was all sunshine, like it was simpler, like it was better than it really was. Our brains are generous editors, and there's another one that always makes me smile. Childbirth amnesia. Now before I say anything else, children are a gift from the Lord. I love mine deeply. I would not trade them for anything. But if childbirth pain were remembered in perfect, high-definition detail forever, the human population might slow down pretty quickly. There's research suggesting that over time, the memory of the pain softens. The sharp edges dull, and the intensity fades. That's not weakness, that's mercy. But here's where it matters. That same softening doesn't just apply to childbirth. We do it with old jobs, old relationships, old habits, old seasons, old churches, old versions of ourselves. We remember the highlights. We forget the anxiety. We forget the late night prayers. We forget how desperate we were for God to change something. And eventually, the thing we once begged to be delivered from starts looking appealing. That's human. But it's not neutral. And it's not biblical. Because Scripture shows us this pattern long before psychology named it. Israel had their own version of selective memory. They called it Egypt. Welcome to Grace in the Grind. This is an off-the-clock episode, a between-seasons pause, a space to slow down when you feel the pull backward, a space to name the tension between where God brought you from and where He's leading you. No shame, no panic, no dramatic life overhaul by the end of the conversation. Just clarity, just honesty, just a reminder that dependence on God is better than predictable chains. If you felt the temptation to go back to an old mindset, an old rhythm, an old version of faith that felt easier, this is a space to sit with that. Grab your coffee, take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin. Before we talk about Israel complaining in the wilderness, we have to remember what Egypt actually was. Egypt wasn't inconvenient. It wasn't a tough chapter. It was slavery. When Moses was a younger man, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave so violently that he intervened and killed the Egyptian. That wasn't a minor conflict. That was brutality. And Moses had to flee. Decades passed. And when God calls Moses back, Exodus tells us something crucial. Israel was groaning under their slavery. They cried out for relief. When Moses had killed the Egyptian decades earlier, Israel wasn't happy, but they weren't crying out the way we see it later on in Exodus. Times had gotten worse. They weren't nostalgic. They weren't desperate. They weren't asking for a better work schedule. They were pleading for deliverance. And then God delivers them in a way that leaves no room for confusion. Passover, the Red Sea splitting open, water from a rock, bread from heaven every morning. These aren't subtle interventions. These aren't the kind of things that you'd think, oh, I'll forget that later. You'd think no one would ever be able to rewrite this story. And yet, Numbers 11 says, we remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. At no cost? At no cost. Really? They forgot the whips. They forgot the fear. They forgot the crying out. They forgot Pharaoh ordering their baby boys thrown into the Nile. And suddenly, slavery gets reduced to a menu. Because in the wilderness, freedom felt uncertain, and slavery felt structured, predictable, manageable, even safe. They don't miss Egypt. They missed control. So let's slow down. The issue wasn't fish. The issue was dependence. Egypt was cruel, but it was predictable. Meals had a rhythm. Work had a rhythm. Tomorrow looked like today. The wilderness, no visible infrastructure, no stored supply, just manna that showed up daily. And dependence feels threatening. Why? Because from Genesis 3 on, sin has been about autonomy, not just doing bad things, but living self-sufficient. The serpent's temptation wasn't be evil. It was be like God, self-governing, self-defining, self-sustaining. Our flesh still prefers control over communion. If I can see the system, predict the pattern, manage the inputs, secure the outcome, I don't have to wake up needing God today. And that's why dependence feels scary. Because dependence requires humility. Dependence requires admitting I can't sustain myself. And that hits our pride. Deuteronomy 8 says, God led them into the wilderness to humble them, to let them hunger, and to feed them with manna. Why? So they would learn that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The wilderness wasn't punishment. It was formation. Egypt trained survival. The wilderness trained trust. And trust feels exposed before it feels secure. And if we're honest, we don't just resist dependence in theory. We build entire systems to avoid it. Not maliciously, just instinctively. Because dependence feels vulnerable. So instead of waking up daily trusting God to provide, we work ourselves into exhaustion so we never have to feel that vulnerable. We take on multiple jobs, not always because it's absolutely necessary, but because it gives us margin that feels like control. We justify debts so we can live at a certain standard, and suddenly we're not free. We're owned. Owned by payments, owned by interest, owned by quiet anxiety that shows up on the first of every month. And we call it stability. But Scripture would gently ask, is it stability or is it sophisticated bondage? Jesus says in Matthew 6 that we cannot serve two masters. He doesn't say we won't try. He says we can't. And sometimes our master isn't Pharaoh. It's the bank. It's the credit card. It's the promotion we can't say no to. It's the lifestyle we don't want to downsize because it would feel like regression. And we tell ourselves, this is responsible. And let's talk about something even more sensitive. If you haven't turned this off by now, you might after this. For some couples, there are seasons when both parents have to work long hours. That's real. That's life. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's wise. Sometimes it's responsible. But sometimes it's fear dressed up as wisdom. And we have to be honest enough to ask which one it is. Not with panic, not with shame, but with clarity. Because there are seasons where we stack our lives so tightly, financially, professionally, socially, that we never pause to ask what dependence on God might require us to release. We become so busy maintaining the machine of our lives that we outsource discipleship by default. And let me say this carefully. This is not a judgment on schools or on families. There are faithful believers teaching in schools. There are godly families navigating complex realities wisely. There are situations where options are limited and families are doing the very best they can. This is not culture war. This is formation. Because discipleship is happening whether we acknowledge it or not. And it's not just curriculum. It's not just teachers. It's not just other students bringing things. Their worldviews, their trauma, their beliefs, their exposure, their language, their wounds, those ride the bus to school. Those sit at the lunch table. They walk the hallways with your children. These things fill spaces between classes. Children disciple each other constantly. And here's something we need to see clearly, without exaggeration. For many families, between the school system, daycare, and after-school programs, children can easily spend 40 to 60 waking hours per week away from home and not with their parents. 40 to 60 hours. That's not an accusation, that's math. And if parents are working outside of those school hours, or bringing work home, or emotionally depleted from sustaining the pace, that doesn't leave many hours for most young children to be intentionally discipled by their parents. Not regularly, not deeply, and not consistently. We cannot protect our children from every exposure to sin. We were never meant to. But if we assume formation will work itself out while most of their waking hours are shaped somewhere else, by the time we notice the drift, it's no longer surface level confusion. It's deeply ingrained beliefs. And we tell ourselves, we'll correct it at home. But if we're rarely at home, or distracted at home, or too depleted to engage, what are we correcting? Again, this isn't condemnation, it's awareness. Because sometimes the systems we build to avoid financial or vocational vulnerability quietly create spiritual vulnerability. And dependence on God often looks like intentional presence. Not perfect, consistent. It looks like conversations, listening, explaining, regrounding truth, prayer together, correcting gently. Not because the world is hopeless, but because formation is constant. And if we're not intentionally discipling at home, something else is. Now, if you don't have kids, don't check out, because the principle is bigger than parenting. The question isn't only, what is discipling my children? It's what's discipling me. Because systems disciple, schedules disciple, debt disciples, career ladders disciple, platforms disciple, comfort disciples. And if we build systems to avoid dependence on God, those systems will eventually enslave us. For some, it's financial. You build a lifestyle that requires a certain income. That income requires a certain job. That job requires a certain pace. That pace requires a certain silence about what you actually feel. And suddenly, you're not choosing freely anymore. You're maintaining. For others, it's achievement. You've built a reputation. You've built credibility. You've built a platform. And now, you're owned by it. You can't risk slowing down. You can't risk changing direction. You can't risk obeying God if it makes you look smaller. And you call it influence. But if the system you built determines what you're allowed to obey, that's not influence. That's bondage. For others, it's comfort. You arrange life around convenience so tightly that anything God asks that disrupts it feels unreasonable. Hard conversations, sacrificial generosity, uncomfortable community, serving when you're tired, because it threatens the system, and the system must be protected. But if the system must be protected at all costs, even obedience, it's not serving you, you're serving it. So the question becomes, what have you built that owns you? What pace? What payment? What platform? What preference? And how is it quietly keeping you from the very thing you say you want? Deeper communion, greater obedience, clearer calling, richer trust. Egypt always offers predictability, but it never offers purpose. God didn't rescue Israel so they could be comfortable. He rescued them so they could worship. And He doesn't save you just to stabilize you. He saves you to sanctify you. Now, let's name this plainly. Progressive sanctification is like swimming upstream. If you've ever tried to swim against a current, you know this. The moment you stop actively moving forward, you don't stay where you are. You drift. And the water doesn't carry you towards maturity. It carries you backward, towards wherever you came from. Spiritually speaking, the current isn't neutral. It's the flesh, the old instinct. It's the world. It's the comfort of familiarity. It's Egypt. Wasn't that bad. It's, I'll deal with it later. It's, I'm too busy right now. And here's what matters. This does not stop in this life. There's no spiritual cruise control. The flesh doesn't retire. Until glory, there is tension. Galatians 5 says the flesh and the spirit are opposed to one another. Romans 7 is Paul, not a brand new believer, describing real conflict. So if you feel the pull backward, it doesn't necessarily mean you're failing. It means you're human. It means you're in the fight. But hear this carefully. This is not try harder. This is not spiritual hustle. This is not white knuckle your way to holiness. This is stay oriented. It's not frantic effort. It's direction. Because coasting in a current is not reset. It's drift. And drift is always towards Egypt. So what are we really saying today? We're saying this. Dependence with God's presence is far better than stability with distance. Egypt had infrastructure. The wilderness had the cloud. Egypt had predictability. The wilderness had daily bread. Egypt had knowing what tomorrow looks like. The wilderness had knowing who leads tomorrow. One had structure without intimacy. The other had intimacy without predictability. And Scripture consistently tells us intimacy is better. You can be financially stable and spiritually numb. You can be professionally successful and relationally distant from God. You can have a schedule that runs like a machine and a soul that's slowly starving. And Jesus' words cut through all of our excuses. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? So no, this isn't do more. This is come closer. Sanctification is not you trying harder to be holy. It's you staying near to the one who is holy. So what do we do with this? Not dramatic overhaul, not panic spiral, small upstream steps. Before the phone, before the calendar, before the scramble, just say, God, I need you today. Not poetic, just honest. Create a margin. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a drive with no noise. Let yourself feel the discomfort you usually avoid. That silence, God will meet you in the silence. That discomfort is often where God meets you. Choose one act of financial humility. Delay a purchase. Downsize something small. Pay down a debt intentionally. Not because money is evil, but because slavery is subtle. For parents, reclaim a simple discipleship rhythm. One prayer at bedtime. One scripture in the car. One conversation at dinner. Not perfect, consistent. Because your kids don't need you to be impressive. They need you to be present. Confess anxiety before you fix it. Instead of immediately managing, God, I'm trying to control this. That's not failure. That's awareness. And awareness is where freedom begins. And listen, these steps aren't earning God's love. They're returning to dependence. They're choosing presence over predictability. They're swimming upstream without panic. So let's land this. It's normal to feel the pull backward. It's human to romanticize old seasons. But Israel didn't miss Egypt. They missed control. And control is not freedom. God's presence in the wilderness is better than Pharaoh's stability in Egypt. Daily bread with God is better than full plates without Him. Uncertain provision with intimacy is better than predictable systems with distance. You are not rescued to return. You are rescued to grow. And the tension you feel, the upstream resistance, is not proof you're failing. It's proof you're alive. Because people comfortable in bondage don't wrestle. If you're wrestling, it means you've tasted freedom. So don't go back. Not because you're scared of sin, but because you were made for communion. Take one small step upstream. Not frantic, faithful. Because dependence with God, if this resonated with you, share it with someone who might be feeling the same pull backward. And if you'd like to support what we're building here, grab a bag of coffee from Arrow and Roots Coffee Company, where faith meets the everyday. Until next time, stay steady, stay honest, stay dependent, and I'll see you in the next cup.